Hamas has handed over 13 Israeli captives in Gaza to the Red Cross. This is the first group of hostages to be released following a deal between the Palestinian militants and Israel. It is reported that the hostages are now in Egypt. The Prime Minister of Thailand has also announced 12 Thai captives have also been released. Around 40 Palestinians in Israeli jails are also expected to be released as part of the 4-day truce. Well, for more on the truce, we are joined by Professor Thomashausen, Unisa Professor Emeritus of International Law. Professor, it's always good to speak to you. Now, how does the international law apply to the Israel-Hamas conflict? Are there specific legal frameworks that govern the actions of the involved parties?
Well, I think this conflict is the one that has disappointed most people about the effectiveness of international law. There are clear principles. Since World War II, we have the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, and they define the war crimes. And one of the serious war crimes is the taking of civilians as hostages. Civilians have to be distinguished from combatants, and the 238 of 240 Israelis that were taken into captivity under Hamas, probably in their tunnel systems, they're definitely not combatants. So now today we have the good news, and I think we mustn't overlook the human factor, that there are many, many families that are really anxiously praying and waiting for nearly 8 weeks now, and they will see 13 freed and liberated. And on the sideline, Egypt managed to also negotiate the freeing of an additional 13 Filipino nationals who will be finally able to go home. But international law has not helped much, except to maybe remind people of the morality and the immorality of conduct, and that it is immoral. It is a serious war crime to take non-combatants hostage.
So let's talk a little about the significance of the temporary ceasefire and the agreement for the release of the hostages. How might these developments impact the overall dynamics of the conflict?
It is a bit of a reminder that nothing is static. Human conduct and human sentiments and political views of people and support for political views change all the time. Like nobody seems to be worrying about, by now, maybe 500,000 dead people in the Ukraine. So it's off the screens. And in Israel, the initial outrage and the outburst, including by the South African government, is probably now making room to a more technical approach. How can we secure the release of the remaining hostages, and how can the situation, the use of force in the Palestine territory that we know as Gaza, can that be reduced and hopefully be brought to an end with a normalization, probably through a peacekeeping force, an international peacekeeping force that, just like in the case of the Eastern Congo, it may have to stay in Gaza for many, many years to come, to keep the levels of hate and the levels of antagonism at bay and under control. And that is something constructive that international law and the international legal order, especially the United Nations, can and should very quickly establish.
Professor, the ceasefire has been declared for 4 days. We expect both parties, or all parties, to adhere to that ceasefire. What happens after 4 days?
Well, we will have serious challenges to the ceasefire pretty soon, because the latest news tell us that part of the ceasefire agreement was a right of the International Red Cross to visit the Israeli hostages held by Hamas, and it is difficult to imagine how that can happen. There will be squabbles about this. There will probably also be squabbles about who actually gets released and how many Palestinian prisoners will be released in return. There will be logistic problems. But let us hope that in these 4 days, a minimum of communication can be re-established between the Hamas leadership and the world leaders, the world community. Originally, South Africa offered to mediate, but then it became very clear it wasn't possible to mediate because there was nobody to communicate with. There was nobody to discuss a solution with. So let us hope that the 4 days are the beginning Israel has offered to extend the ceasefire for many days, as long as every day 10 hostages are released. So that could be quite a length of time, and that could become the basis for stepping away from what became such a bloody and bitter exchange of military force.
Now, you speak about South Africa making an attempt to speak to the parties and obviously come to some form of a ceasefire agreement, or at least some talks of sorts. Now, South Africa is one of those countries that has called out Israel, in fact, called out the International Criminal Court on Israel. But we do know that Qatar, the United States, and Egypt were the successful parties in brokering this deal at the moment. Is South Africa's stance one of the contributory factors that makes them a party that, I suppose, would not be privy to brokering a deal because of their position against Israel?
Well, South Africa's running ahead of many other countries, including the BRICS, has surprised the international community and very, very many. Of course, it has pleased, it has satisfied ambitions and emotions here in the country amongst the Muslim population, but not all. So, because there are many, many shades, there are Shia and there are Sunni Muslims, and Hamas is actually a Sunni Muslim movement that is not unconditionally supported by, for instance, Iran, who is the next new BRICS member. And the summit, the virtual summit through Zoom that was held earlier this week, and that was called by President Ramaphosa as the chair, the current chair of the BRICS, was unable to come to a joint declaration. All we were able to get was a summary of the discussions and the proceedings, because many BRICS members, especially India, but also the future BRIC members, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they see no benefit. They see nothing good coming from labeling, from branding one of the parties in this conflict, for instance, from saying Israel is a terrorist state, or Israel is an apartheid state, or Israel is guilty of genocide. All these labels are very doubtful because international law gives us definitions. Again, a genocide is only present if there is a policy, an intent to exterminate, to destroy a people, as we had it in Rwanda, and of course as we had it in the Holocaust in Germany. And an apartheid state is one that denies equal political participation to a significant segment of its population. And since Palestine desires to be an own independent state and is in the meantime recognized by the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and many others as an independent state, then as an independent state, its citizens could only exercise political rights within that state. So you cannot actually label Israel an apartheid state just because somebody thinks that the Palestinian population should be able to vote for the Israeli parliament. And in fact, a lot of Palestinian people that live as citizens in Israel, they do vote. So these labeling attempts, however exciting they may be for political activists, they're not conducive to peace. And this is why the BRICS did not join South Africa in, for instance, breaking off diplomatic relations with Israel.
Now, it also brings into spotlight the issue around international law and whom it serves. And the reason I say this is, if we go a few months back into the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the International Criminal Court was hastily called upon Vladimir Putin for various crimes war crimes that he's supposedly committed. Now, we have seen many thousands of innocent civilians being killed in Gaza, but the International Criminal Court has not raised a finger, so to speak. Does it then suggest that the sway of the International Criminal Court is dependent on who's crying foul?
Well, in the case of Palestine, the International Criminal Court has been seized, is busy. with an investigation into what is happening in Gaza for 3 years already. In 2021, there was a ruling by the pre-trial chamber confirming that Palestine is a state and the Palestine government is responsible for what happens in Gaza, even if it is not that government, but the organization Hamas that actually exercises power there. So, and Chief Prosecutor Khan has confirmed only a few days ago that, of course, the International Criminal Court will investigate war crimes in the territory of Gaza, but possibly against leaders of Hamas, because the International Criminal Court does not have a jurisdiction over Israel, and it cannot just on its own initiative issue a warrant of arrest for Israeli officials or the Israeli Prime Minister unless there is an accusation of a war of aggression. The accusation of a war of aggression against Russia was the legal bridge, the legal connection that allowed, in terms of procedure, the International Criminal Court to issue a warrant against President Putin as the person that they held responsible for what they considered to be a war of aggression. That's how it came about with President Putin, but it is not quite that easy in the case of Gaza, because definitely there is no war of aggression by Israel. There's an act of self-defense against an aggression committed on the Israeli
at what point
territory.
does self-defense stop? I mean, at what point do you go beyond self-defense? I mean, you kill 10,000, 11,000 civilians and only a handful of Hamas. Do you keep at it until you feel the time is ready for you to stop? Where do you draw the line?
Well, international scholars agree throughout the world that Israel's measures were excessive. What is excessive in a situation of self-defense? That is, if you use more force than necessary to protect yourself. This is even for us individuals. If we find somebody entering our home by force with a gun, we can only defend ourselves with a firearm if there is an immediate and clear threat to our own lives. So the question of proportionality within self-defense, of course, has been modified by state practice. Many people overlook this. It is not just the written agreements and the writings of the scholars, but it's also what do states do. And since World War II, states all over the world have claimed the right to exercise preemptive self-defense, to act even before you are attacked, but when you are convinced that an attack is imminent. This is what Russia invokes in their military intervention in the Ukraine, that an attack on Russia was imminent and therefore they were entitled to act in self-defense. And then, of course, there are other very thorny issues. If civilian installations, hospitals, allow themselves to be misused for military command centers of the people committing war crimes, for instance, then they lose their protection as civilians, and the right of self-defense can make a very, very difficult weighing of lives. It can say, in order to save the hostages, we will sacrifice the civilians that are guarding, that are hiding the combatants of the other side. But, as I said, the majority of scholars and the UN accuse Israel now of having acted excessively. And let us hope that this ceasefire will bring back some reason, will tame the national emotions, the anger, the rage even, by the victims of the attack on October 7th, and that this will also bring about a change in the Israeli national policy, and that from here on we can look more constructively at the future of Palestine. Palestine is a state, it is a recognized state, it is entitled to look after its people, it's entitled to a territory. The territory of Palestine has to be looked at, especially by all the countries in that region. You cannot have a sort of Bophuthatswana, patches of land everywhere, and call that a state territory.
Professor, my final question speaks to the issues around the anger and ire that both parties are entitled to feel and have felt. And you talk about a quelling of that anger. Is that really a practical way of looking at it? I've watched a number of clips where individuals have lost their children, have had to carry their babies in their arms because they've been shot or they've died from gunfire coming from Israel. And vis-a-vis, there were those that were attacked and killed, I think 1,300, 1,400 in Israel. Do you expect these individuals who are members of both Israel and Palestine, or Gaza on the other hand, to come out and say, okay, you know what, let's pull up that white flag and sign a truce? Or is that anger going to simmer for quite some time?
Look, I was born in Germany, and I'm very familiar with the German national sensitivities and feelings and pain. And World War II cost the lives of about 30 million Germans and about 34 million Russians. And in addition, there was a genocide against the Jewish people, which cost about 6 million Jewish lives. How do you live after such a horrendous, terrible number of years? It will take a lot of healing. It will take a lot of sobering up. It will take responsible politicians that do not carry on tearing open the wounds. But it will also require, as South Africa knew in the TRC and the Truth Commission process, it will require an establishment of what actually happened and why it happened and how it happened. And it is, of course, a human tragedy that 80 years after the start of World War II, we are so close to seeing again a major worldwide conflict that could cost millions of lives, not just 10,000 or 500,000. We have seen it simmering in the Middle East. In Syria, about 500,000 people died in the insistence of the Syrian government to stay in power and use brutal military force to quell any opposition. In the Yemen, about 150 to 160 million civilians died in bombing raids that were mostly conducted by Saudi Arabia for their own regional policy reasons.
Professor,
so the region is in fire. Let us hope that this truth, that this ceasefire is the beginning of a rational process.
Professor, it's always good to speak to you. Appreciate your insights. Professor Andre Thomashausen.